welcome back to Darkling Fables. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey to the depths of the Barents Sea, to a place where sunlight never reaches, and where the pressure of the ocean can crush steel like an empty soda can. Before we begin, I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine being trapped in a metal tube, hundreds of feet underwater, with no way to communicate with the outside world. As frigid water slowly rises around you, the air is thinning, the temperature is dropping, and you know that unless something miraculous happens, this cold, dark place will become your tomb. This isn't fiction, my friends. This is the reality that 118 men of the Russian Northern Fleet, faced in August of 2000. I've spent months researching this tragedy, speaking with naval experts, studying declassified reports, and corresponding with families of the crew. International tension, and ultimately, devastating loss. So settle in, perhaps dim the lights, and join me as we descend into one of the most harrowing submarine disasters in modern history. This is a story that needs to be told and remembered. The morning of August 12, 2000, dawned crisp and clear over the Barents Sea. Located in the Arctic Ocean, north of Norway and Russia, these waters had long been a theater for Cold War tensions and remained strategically vital to Russia's Northern Fleet. On this particular day, the fleet was engaged in its largest naval exercise in years, a demonstration of strength meant to signal Russia's military resurgence under its new president, Vladimir Putin, who had been sworn in just 3 months earlier. At the heart of the exercise was the K-141 Kursk, the pride of the Russian submarine fleet. Commissioned in 1994, the Kursk was a technological marvel, an Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, stretching 154 meters in length, roughly equal to 2 football fields laid end to end. With its double hull made of high-grade steel alloy, the Kursk was designed to withstand tremendous pressure and even direct torpedo strikes. Russian naval commanders often boasted that it was unsinkable. Captain Gennady Lyachin stood on the conning tower of the Kursk early that morning, taking in what would be his last glimpse of daylight. At 44 years old, Lyachin was considered one of the Russian Navy's finest submarine commanders, experienced, level-headed, and meticulously careful with the safety of his crew. He had been awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation Medal, the country's highest honor, for a previous mission in the Mediterranean. His men respected him deeply, and many had requested transfers specifically to serve under his command. As Lyachin descended into the submarine and ordered the hatch sealed, the 118 men aboard settled into their routines. The crew was an interesting mix. Russian naval commanders often boasted that it was unsinkable. Captain Gennady Lyachin stood on the conning tower of the Kursk early that morning, taking in what would be his last glimpse of daylight. At 44 years old, Lyachin was considered one of the Russian Navy's finest submarine commanders, experienced, level-headed, and meticulously careful with the safety of his crew. He had been awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation Medal, the country's highest honor, for a previous mission in the Mediterranean. His men respected him deeply, and many had requested transfers specifically to serve under his command. As Lyachin descended into the submarine and ordered the hatch sealed, the 118 men aboard settled into their routines. The crew was an interesting mix. Hardened veterans from the Soviet era worked alongside fresh-faced young sailors, some barely out of their teens. For many of these younger crew members, serving on the Kursk was their first posting, and they took tremendous pride in being assigned to such a prestigious vessel. Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, the commander of the turbine room, wrote a quick note to his wife Olga before getting to his station. "Everything is fine. We're preparing for the exercise. I'll see you soon." He tucked the note into his pocket, planning to mail it when they returned to port in a few days. Kolesnikov, 27, had recently married, and pictures of Olga decorated his small sleeping quarters. In another section of the submarine, 19-year-old seaman Mikhail Bochkov was nervous. This was his first major exercise, and the youngest member of the Kursk crew wanted to impress his supervisors. He had told his mother before departing that serving on the Kursk was like winning the lottery for a naval career. The submarine submerged at 8:51 a.m. Its orders were to fire dummy torpedoes at a battle cruiser participating in the exercise, demonstrating the devastating stealth capabilities that made submarines such feared weapons. The Kursk carried 24 cruise missiles and 24 torpedoes, though for this exercise, the warheads had been replaced with instrumentation packages to record hints. Unknown to Captain Lyachin or his crew, one of the torpedoes loaded into the Kursk's tubes was not standard issue. It was an older Type 6576A torpedo that used hydrogen peroxide as propellant. These HTP high-test peroxide torpedoes had been largely phased out by most navies because of their volatility. The United States and British navies had abandoned peroxide torpedoes decades earlier after several accidents demonstrated their instability. But cash-strapped Russia still maintained some in its arsenal, despite their known risks. At 11:28 a.m., nearly 2.5 hours after submerging, the Kursk requested permission to fire its practice torpedoes. Permission was granted, and Captain Lyachin ordered the torpedo room crew to prepare for firing. The procedure was routine. They had done it dozens of times before. In the torpedo room at the front of the submarine, sailors carefully prepared the weapons. The Kursk was designed with an internal loading system that allowed torpedoes to be loaded into the tubes without exposing the crew to the external water pressure. It was a sophisticated system when it worked properly. At precisely 11:29:34 a.m., seismic detectors across northern Europe registered a minor shockwave measuring approximately 1.5 on the Richter scale, emanating from the Barents Sea. The shock was small enough that the Russian Fleet Command didn't immediately recognize its significance. But aboard the Kursk, catastrophe had just struck. In the torpedo room at the front of the submarine, sailors carefully prepared the weapons. The Kursk was designed with an internal loading system that allowed torpedoes to be loaded into the tubes without exposing the crew to the external water pressure. It was a sophisticated system when it worked properly. At precisely 11:29:34 a.m., seismic detectors across northern Europe registered a minor shockwave. Measuring approximately 1.5 on the Richter scale, emanating from the Barents Sea. The shock was small enough that the Russian Fleet Command didn't immediately recognize its significance. But aboard the Kursk, catastrophe had just struck. The hydrogen peroxide in the Type 6576A torpedo had leaked through a faulty weld or valve and come in contact with the copper components within the torpedo tube. The resulting chemical reaction created intense heat, essentially turning the torpedo into an unintended time bomb. When the pressure and temperature reached critical levels, the torpedo exploded while still inside its tube. The initial explosion was relatively contained, damaging the inner hull, but not catastrophic in itself. Had this been the only explosion, the Kursk might have survived. Injured crew members in the forward compartment would have sealed the watertight doors, and the submarine could have attempted an emergency surfacing. But the crew never had that chance. Just 135 seconds after the first explosion, a far more powerful detonation tore through the submarine. The initial blast had detonated the warheads of several other torpedoes stored in the forward compartment, creating an explosion equivalent to 3 to 7 tons of TNT. This second explosion registered 4.2 on the Richter scale, powerful enough to be recorded by seismic stations 3,000 miles away in Alaska. The blast instantly killed everyone in the forward 5 compartments of the submarine. The watertight bulkhead between the 5th and 6th compartments buckled but held, temporarily protecting the crew members in the rear of the vessel. The force of the explosion slammed the Kursk, traveling at periscope depth, directly into the seabed approximately 350 feet below the surface of the Barents Sea. In the aft compartments, the surviving crew members experienced something like a high-speed car crash. Men were thrown against equipment, suffering broken bones and concussions. Emergency lights flickered on as the main electrical system failed. The air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and electrical fires. In the 9th compartment, at the very rear of the submarine, 23 men found themselves alive, but cut off from the rest of the vessel. Among them was Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, who, as the highest-ranking officer present, took command of the survivors. Their situation was dire. The explosion had disabled the submarine's main communication systems, meaning they had no way to contact the surface. The nuclear reactors had automatically shut down in the emergency, cutting off main power. And worst of all, water was slowly seeping into their compartment. On the surface, the Russian Northern Fleet continued its exercises, unaware of the disaster unfolding below. It wasn't until the Kursk failed to check in at its scheduled 3:30 p.m. communication that concerns began to arise. Even then, the Fleet Command assumed it was a minor communication problem. The Kursk was, after all, unsinkable. As evening approached, the fleet finally acknowledged that something might have happened to the submarine. Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, commander of the Northern Fleet, ordered a search operation to commence, but poor weather conditions and fading light hampered initial efforts. Inside the stricken Kursk, the survivors in the 9th compartment assessed their options. The submarine had emergency escape capsules, but the explosion had rendered them unusable. They could potentially use the emergency escape hatch, but without pressure suits, ascending from 350 feet would likely result in fatal cases of the bends. Their best hope was to conserve oxygen and wait for rescue. Kolesnikov kept morale up as best he could. He organized the men into shifts to manually operate the emergency oxygen regeneration system, a chemical process that would absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. It was a stopgap measure at best, buying them perhaps a few additional days of air. By the morning of August 13th, the Russian Navy had confirmed that the Kursk was missing. Several ships, including the Peter the Great battlecruiser, were dispatched to the submarine's last known coordinates. At 4:51 p.m., sonar detected the outline of the Kursk resting on the seabed. Still, Naval Command remained optimistic. telling the media that the submarine had experienced minor technical difficulties and that the crew was in no danger. This was the beginning of a pattern of misinformation, that would characterize the entire Kursk incident. While Russian officials publicly expressed confidence, privately they were growing increasingly alarmed. No contact had been established with the Kursk, and the submarine's emergency transponder had not activated as it would in a controlled emergency. Inside the ninth compartment, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The temperature had dropped to near freezing as the submarine's heating systems failed. The men huddled together for warmth, taking turns operating the oxygen regeneration system. Some had been injured in the initial explosion, and without medical supplies, their conditions worsened. It was around this time that Kolesnikov wrote what would become the most haunting document recovered from the Kursk. Using a chemical light stick for illumination, he wrote a note to his wife and any rescuers who might eventually reach them. 13:15. All personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 moved to section 9. There are 23 of us here. We made this decision as a result of the accident. None of us can get up to the surface. I'm writing blindly. It's too dark to write, but I'll try by feel. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections who are now in the ninth and will attempt to get out. Greetings to everyone. No need to despair. The note continued with the names of the survivors, then ended with a personal message. I love you all. Don't despair. On the surface, the Russian rescue operation was plagued by inadequate equipment and poor coordination. The Northern Fleet's deep-sea rescue vehicles were obsolete and poorly maintained. The first rescue bell, the Kolokol, was deployed on August 14th, but failed to create a seal with the Kursk's escape hatch due to the angle at which the submarine was resting on the seabed. Meanwhile, offers of international assistance were pouring in. Both the British and Norwegian governments offered specialized deep-sea rescue equipment and experienced personnel. The United States proposed sending a sophisticated rescue submarine designed specifically for such operations. But in a decision that would later provoke intense controversy, the Russian government declined these offers, insisting that their own rescue teams could handle the situation. This reluctance stemmed partly from military secrecy. The Kursk contained classified weapons systems and nuclear technology that Russia was unwilling to expose to foreign observation. But it also reflected the lingering Cold War mentality within the Russian military establishment and the new Putin administration's determination to project an image of self-sufficiency. By August 15, 3 days after the disaster, the situation could no longer be minimized. Russian officials finally admitted to the media that the Kursk had suffered a serious accident. Still, they maintained that contact had been established with the crew through a system of tapping on the hull and that oxygen levels within the submarine remained adequate. This was a lie. No communication had been established, and naval experts knew that even with the emergency oxygen systems, the air in the Kursk would have become toxic after approximately 3 days. Inside the ninth compartment, the survivors were running out of time. The chemical oxygen generators they were using produced heat as a byproduct, which normally would be managed by the submarine's ventilation systems. But with those systems inoperative, the heat accumulated dangerously. Moreover, the candles contained perchlorate, which in high concentrations could combust when in contact with organic material like oil or human sweat. According to later forensic analysis, sometime between the evening of August 14 and the morning of August 15, a fire broke out in the ninth compartment. With oxygen already limited, the fire would have quickly consumed what breathable air remained. Official Russian reports would later conclude that all crew members died no later than August 15, approximately 3 days after the initial explosion. On the surface, as public pressure mounted and the initial rescue efforts failed repeatedly, the Russian government finally accepted international assistance. On August 20th, 8 days after the disaster, Norwegian deep-sea divers reached the Kursk. Using specialized equipment, they opened the escape hatch on the ninth compartment, confirming what many had already feared. There were no survivors. The recovery operation that followed was an engineering marvel on its own. The Kursk's nuclear reactors posed a severe environmental risk, and the vessel itself contained evidence crucial to understanding what had happened. Rather than attempt to raise the entire submarine immediately, authorities decided to first recover the bodies of the crew. Russian deep-sea divers, joined by specialists from Norway, worked for 16 days to recover 12 bodies, including that of Captain Lyachin. The recovery of Lieutenant Captain Kolesnikov's body also brought to the surface his handwritten note, providing the first concrete evidence of what had happened to the crew after the explosion. The condition of the recovered bodies confirmed the theory about the fire in the ninth compartment, with evidence of smoke inhalation and burns. Perhaps mercifully, forensic analysis suggested that the end had come relatively quickly for these last survivors, with carbon monoxide poisoning likely rendering them unconscious before they died. The remaining bodies would not be recovered until the Kursk itself was raised in a remarkable engineering operation in October 2001. Using a specialized barge and an intricate system of cables, the submarine, minus its destroyed bow section, which was too damaged to safely recover, was lifted from the seabed and transported to a dry dock in Murmansk. There, investigators could finally piece together exactly what had happened on that August morning a year earlier. The political fallout from the Kursk disaster was immediate and far-reaching. The Russian government's handling of the crisis, the initial denials, the refused international assistance, and the lack of information provided to the families of the crew sparked widespread public outrage. In a notorious television interview on August 23, 2000, Larry King asked President Putin what had happened to the Kursk. Putin answered with a slight smile, "It sank." This apparent callousness, coupled with the fact that Putin had not interrupted his vacation to deal with the crisis personally, severely damaged his popularity among the Russian public. The families of the Kursk crew were particularly vocal in their criticism. During a meeting with government officials in Vidyayevo, the submarine's home base, grieving relatives were forcibly sedated when they became too emotional in their questioning. This incident, captured on camera by one attendee, provoked international condemnation. In response to this criticism, the Putin administration shifted its approach dramatically. The government established generous compensation packages for the families of the victims. Putin himself met with several of the widows and parents, showing a more compassionate face to the public. Most significantly, he authorized an unusually transparent investigation into the causes of the disaster, breaking with the Soviet-era tradition of military secrecy. That investigation concluded in July 2002, finding that the initial explosion had been caused by the leaking HTP torpedo. The report criticized the Navy's continued use of these unstable weapons and identified numerous shortcomings in rescue procedures. Several high-ranking naval officers, including Admiral Popov, were dismissed from their positions as a result. However, no criminal charges were ever filed against any officials, a fact that many families found difficult to accept. Criticism particularly focused on the decision to include the experimental torpedo in a training exercise and the delayed acceptance of international rescue assistance. For the families of the 118 men lost aboard the Kursk, the official explanations did little to ease their grief. Each year, on August 12th, they gather at the Serafimovoskoye Cemetery in St. Petersburg, where most of the crew members are buried, to remember their loved ones. The legacy of the Kursk disaster extends beyond the personal tragedies. It marked a turning point in how the Russian government communicated with its citizens during crises. The initial instinct toward secrecy and self-sufficiency gave way to a recognition that transparency and international cooperation were sometimes necessary. The Russian Navy underwent significant reforms as well. Older, potentially dangerous torpedoes were removed from service. Rescue equipment was modernized, and agreements were established with NATO countries for mutual assistance in future submarine emergencies. Perhaps most importantly, training and safety procedures were overhauled to prevent similar accidents. For the international submarine community, the Kursk served as a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in operating beneath the waves. Submarine duty has always been considered among the most hazardous military assignments, but the loss of an allegedly unsinkable modern vessel shocked naval experts worldwide. The disaster also revealed the lingering tensions of the post-Cold War era. Initial speculation by some Western analysts suggested that the Kursk might have collided with an American or British submarine that was monitoring the Russian naval exercises, a theory that persists in some circles despite the conclusive forensic evidence about the torpedo explosion. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Kursk is the human story, the courage of men like Dmitry Kolesnikov, who maintained order and hope even as their situation grew desperate. His note, written in darkness as death approached, captures both the terror of their predicament and the remarkable composure with which they faced it. "It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel," he wrote, leaving what he must have known would be his final message to the world. Don't despair. 23 years after the disaster, the memory of the Kursk remains powerful in Russia. A monument in Murmansk depicts a sailor looking out to sea, his hand raised as if in a final farewell. Beneath him are inscribed 118 names, men whose lives ended too soon in the cold depths of the Barents Sea. The story of the Kursk is many things: a military tragedy, a political scandal, an engineering case study, but at its heart, it is a tale of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us of the special breed of men who willingly seal themselves inside steel tubes and descend into the hostile environment of the deep ocean, and of the terrible price sometimes paid for technological failures and human misjudgments. In submarine services around the world, there exists a saying, "We dive so that others may sleep peacefully." The men of the Kursk paid the ultimate price in service to that ideal. Their legacy lives on in the improvements made to submarine safety in the wake of their loss, potentially saving countless lives in the years since. As the families of the Kursk crew mark each passing anniversary, they keep alive the memory of 118 men who embarked on a routine training exercise and never returned. Young men like Mikhail Bachkov, who considered his assignment to the prestigious submarine winning the lottery. devoted husbands like Dmitry Kolesnikov, who used his final moments to write messages of love to those he would never see again. Respected commanders he would never see again. Respected commanders like Captain Gennady Lyachin, who went down with his vessel as naval tradition dictates. The depths of the Barents Sea have given up most of their secrets about what happened during those fateful days in August 2000. The Kursk itself now exists only in photographs and memories, having been dismantled after the investigation concluded. Its nuclear reactors were safely removed, its weapon systems studied and documented, its hull cut apart for scrap. But one question continues to haunt those familiar with the disaster. Could those 23 survivors in the ninth compartment have been saved had the Russian government accepted international help immediately? Experts remain divided. Some believe that even with immediate assistance, the men would have perished before rescuers could reach them. Others maintain that a prompt, multinational rescue effort might have saved at least some of the trapped sailors. This unanswerable question perhaps explains why the Kursk continues to fascinate and disturb us more than 2 decades later. It represents not just a technological failure, but a human one, a case where pride, secrecy, and institutional inertia may have cost precious lives. In 2004, a Russian film director named Vincent Balabanov attempted to create a documentary about the disaster, interviewing families and former naval officials. During production, he reportedly received multiple warnings to abandon the project. When he persisted, his funding was mysteriously withdrawn, and much of his research material disappeared from his office during a break-in. The documentary was never completed. This suggests that even years after the official investigation concluded, certain aspects of the Kursk disaster remained sensitive to Russian authorities. What additional secrets might be hidden in classified files may not be known for decades, if ever. For now, what remains is the human story of men who chose a dangerous profession, who faced death with dignity, and whose loss prompted important reforms, and of families who continue to seek answers and remembrance for their loved ones. In his final note, Kolesnikov wrote, "I'm writing blindly. It seems like there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this." His words did reach the world, carrying a message of love and calm courage from the darkness of the ocean depths. Each year on August 12th, bells toll in Russian naval bases, flowers are laid at memorials, and for a moment, a nation remembers 118 men who went into the abyss and never returned. Men whose story reminds us of both the terrible power of the sea and the even greater power of human dignity in the face of death. The Kursk rests no more on the ocean floor, but its legacy endures, a silent warning about the dangers of technological hubris and the high price of political pride, and a testament to the special courage of those who serve beneath the waves, where the margin between life and death can be measured in millimeters of steel and seconds of time. And there you have it, my friends, the true story of the Kursk submarine disaster, a tragedy that reminds us how quickly life can change, how technology can fail us in the most catastrophic ways, and how government deception can compound human suffering. I want to thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey. Stories like these aren't easy to tell or to hear, but they're important. They honor the memories of those who were lost and remind us of the real human cost behind the headlines we so quickly forget. If you found this story meaningful, please consider hitting that subscribe button to join our Darkling Fables family. Your support allows me to continue researching and sharing these important historical accounts that might otherwise fade from memory. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps you remember when this disaster happened, or maybe you have questions about aspects of the story I've shared tonight. I read every comment and do my best to respond to as many as I can. And if you know someone with an interest in naval history, modern Russia, or powerful true stories of human courage, please share this video with them. These stories deserve to be remembered. Until next time, this is Darkling Fables, keeping the light of remembrance burning for those who are lost in darkness. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and I'll see you in the next exploration of history's most powerful true stories.